I stood in the center of the grand atrium, where sunlight slanted through the glass ceiling and spilled like golden truth over a lie that had grown too big to contain. Portraits of my husband adorned every wall, a curated life in brushstrokes and bronze. People whispered his name like a hymn, never questioning the myth they'd been fed. But I remembered the ashes he left behind, our daughter's screams, the secrets sewn into my seams, and the empire he stole from the bones of others. They said I was the quiet one, the grieving widow. They never saw the notebooks I kept. They never noticed the keys I never returned. And now, as I walked through the doors of the Hargrave Museum for the first time in decades, I came not as a guest, but as the final exhibit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Welcome to Ashes Under Glass, a haunting tale of legacy, deception, and long-buried vengeance. Told through the eyes of Eleanor Hargrave, an aging woman the world mistook for a shadow. But sometimes, the quietest ones write the loudest truths. Settle in. This story has been waiting, patiently, just like Eleanor. Water bills. It didn't bear a return address, only my name in a handwriting I hadn't seen in 32 years. The moment I saw it, my hands began to tremble. Not with fear, but with memory. I took it inside without removing my coat. The kettle was shrieking on the stove, steam clouding the windows of the old cottage I'd retreated to after everything fell apart. But the moment I slit that envelope open and tipped it forward, only one thing slid out. A key. Small, tarnished, and cold in my palm. No note. No explanation. But I knew exactly what it opened. Room 12, East Wing, Hargrave Museum. It was never meant to exist. That room was built behind walls, tucked away before the museum's grand unveiling. My late husband, Richard, had it sealed, quite literally, before the first gala was ever held. It was where we kept the things no one was ever supposed to see. I sat down, the key biting into my fingers. I hadn't thought about that room in decades, not since the day they took our daughter away. The museum had become something of a shrine to Richard Hargrave, celebrated artist, philanthropist, the tortured genius. The press adored him. Even in death, his legend grew, bloated with every exhibit and every gala, his face cast in bronze at the museum's entrance. A martyr to his work, they said. A visionary. But they never asked about the woman who lived in his shadow. They never asked about the blood behind the brushstrokes. Or the child who disappeared. They never asked about me. I slipped the key into the pocket of my coat and left the envelope on the counter beside a pile of unopened sympathy cards. They weren't recent. People had stopped writing years ago. But somehow, grief sticks to everything. Like dust on glass. Easy to ignore until the light shifts. As I stood at the threshold of the front door, I looked back once at the quiet of the cottage. The ticking clock, the wilting roses, the framed photo of Richard and me, taken before the museum, before the madness, before the silences became walls. I should have burned that photo years ago, but some ghosts demand witnesses. Outside, the cold bit hard. The clouds hung low, pregnant with snow. The road to the Hargrave Museum was long, winding through the woods like a question you never wanted answered. I hadn't driven it in years, but I remembered every bend, every tree that lined the way like mourners at a funeral procession. They thought I'd never return. They were wrong. The gates loomed taller than I remembered. Twisted wrought iron, blackened by decades of weather, still bearing the Hargrave crest, a stylized phoenix rising from flame. Richard's idea. Always so poetic, even in his hypocrisy. He adored the symbolism of rebirth, yet never gave anyone around him the chance to begin again. Only himself, over and over. With each lie, each betrayal, each unfinished canvas passed off as brilliance. The security guard barely glanced at me as I stepped through the main entrance. That was the thing about old women, we become invisible. To the young, we are dust in motion. Fragile, harmless. He didn't even notice the key in my coat pocket. Or maybe he didn't care. Inside, the museum breathed differently. The marble floors echoed beneath my footsteps like hollow declarations. The air smelled of old polish, artificial lilies, and pride. Every wall bore Richard's legacy, paintings of tragic-eyed women, faceless children, swirling storms in unnatural colors. Critics called them revolutionary. I called them convenient. Abstractions were useful when you didn't want anyone asking what you were really saying. I paused in front of one piece near the atrium. Untitled Number 4. A favorite among collectors. They said it captured the essence of motherhood. I stared at it for a long time. It was painted the week our daughter vanished. No one knew that, of course. No one ever bothered to match the timelines. No one questioned why I stopped attending exhibits, stopped smiling in the press photos. They assumed grief had silenced me. But grief never did. Grief screams. It scratches at your throat and makes its home in your lungs until breathing becomes remembering. Silence? That was survival. I moved past the main gallery, my steps careful, deliberate. The lights above buzzed faintly as I entered the east corridor. This wing was always colder. Less foot traffic. Even during peak visiting hours, people skipped it. The featured works in this section were darker, more chaotic, what critics called his descent. They didn't know it was the beginning of mine. Room 12 had no sign. It was wedged between two permanent exhibits, concealed behind a blank stretch of wall. No knob, no marker, just flat white paint and a faint seam, like a mouth that had been stitched shut. Only those who'd helped build the museum would know it was there. Only those who had reason to hide something. I slipped the key from my coat and held it in my palm. For a moment, I hesitated. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. I'd imagined this moment for years, but now that it was here, something sharp twisted in my chest. Not guilt, not dread, resolve. The key slid into the hidden panel with a soft click. When the door opened, it did so silently. No creak, no groan, just an intake of breath from a room that had waited too long to be seen. And there it was. Every secret they thought they'd buried. Covered in dust. Preserved in silence. Waiting. The air inside room 12 was different. Heavier. The kind of air you feel before a storm, not quite oppressive, but charged. Every step into that forgotten space felt like walking across time's spine. The door shut quietly behind me, sealing out the polished lie of the museum and sealing in something far less rehearsed. The walls were bare cement. No curated lighting. No placards or descriptions. Just cold storage. Dust. And truth. I didn't need to turn on the overhead light. I reached instead for the wall-mounted lamp I remembered from decades ago. It flickered once, then buzzed to life, casting a warm halo over the room's contents. Stacks of canvases leaned against one wall, most covered with stained drop cloths. Wooden crates sat piled on the floor, labeled in my own handwriting. And in the far corner, beneath a tarpaulin that had yellowed with time, stood the one thing I'd both feared and longed to see again. The ledger. Not just any ledger, his ledger. The one I kept when Richard's commissions grew too large, too numerous to manage without help. The one that detailed the names of buyers, the amounts exchanged, the works never disclosed to the public. The private commissions. The arrangements. He used to call them gifts. But I knew better. I crossed the room and lifted the tarp. There it was. Untouched. Bound in cracked leather, held shut with the ribbon I'd tied myself. My fingers brushed the cover as if it might vanish. Then I opened it. Page after page, name after name. Some of them I hadn't thought of in decades, investors, gallery owners, wealthy clients who wanted special pieces. The ones Richard painted behind closed doors. The ones we never documented publicly. The ones that were never meant to be seen. I turned the pages until I reached the back section, the one he never looked at. The one I kept for myself. That was where the real entries lived. March 8, 1992, Elena's portrait, unfinished. Richard snapped again. Called it a curse on canvas. Locked it away. March 13th, 1992, child's voice heard again in the gallery. Richard insists it's just me. March 20th, 1992, he moved the painting to room 12. Said it would silence her. He's wrong. March 28th, 1992, our daughter stopped speaking. My vision blurred. The ink swam. I pressed the page flat with my hand, willing it to stay real. Elena. They all said she ran away. A rebellious teenager, sick of the mansion, the museum, the expectations. That was the story the papers ran. Richard made sure of it. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was the genius. I was just the wife. But I knew the truth. And I'd written it down so I wouldn't forget. Because on the night she vanished, I found something. Something Richard tried to destroy but couldn't quite bring himself to burn. A painting. A portrait of our daughter. But not as she was. As he saw her. And it was still here. Somewhere in this room. I set the ledger aside and began to uncover the canvases, one by one. Most were harmless, studies, sketches, forgotten commissions. But as I reached the fourth row, my hands began to shake. It was the frame I recognized first. Gold leaf, custom made, slightly warped on the left corner. Richard hated imperfection. But he'd kept this one anyway. I pulled the canvas into the light. There she was. Elena. Her eyes wide, her mouth open in a scream no one could hear. The colors were unnatural, blues where skin should be, shadows carved into her cheeks like scars. But it was her. My daughter. My child, captured in a moment of terror, immortalized on canvas like a confession. There was something written in the corner, hidden beneath layers of brushwork. I scraped at the dried paint with my fingernail until the letters emerged. She knew. My heart thundered in my chest. He'd left a message. To me? To himself? Or to the people he thought might one day come looking? The silence of the room pressed in tighter. But I didn't look away from the painting, because for the first time in years, I could hear her again. Elena. Calling me. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. I wrapped the painting in an old canvas drop cloth and set it gently against the wall, as if it might breathe beneath the fabric. My fingers lingered on the edge a little too long, afraid that if I let go, she would vanish again. There were two of them I'd lost to that room. Elena was the obvious one. But the second was the woman I used to be, Eleanor, the wife, the supporter, the faithful shadow of Richard Hargrave. The one who smiled at the galas and stood 2 steps behind. The one who nodded when he said she was imagining things. That woman had lived here, in this room, long before I ever returned. And she was buried under everything he left behind. But I wasn't her anymore. I turned back to the ledger and tore out the last few pages, the ones with Elena's entries, the private ones, the only record of what truly happened. I tucked them inside my coat, along with the key. This was evidence now. I didn't know exactly what I was building, justice, revenge, clarity, but I knew the foundation started here. If I left those pages behind, they'd vanish the same way my daughter had. I was halfway through the room when I heard it. A voice. Faint. Distant. But there. It wasn't Elena's. It was a man's voice, young, clipped, rehearsed. Someone in the next gallery, giving a tour. And here you'll find Richard Hargrave's descent into surrealism, beginning around 1992, following the unexplained disappearance of his only child. I froze. He said it so casually, like a footnote. The unexplained disappearance of his only child. They had made her part of his myth. I moved to the peephole in the wall, one Richard had insisted be installed to monitor light spill into the sealed room. I pressed my eye to the glass. On the other side stood a tour group, dozen or so patrons, some elderly, some clutching museum pamphlets. And at the front, wearing a navy blazer and a perfect smile, stood the man narrating the story. Young, sharp, ambitious, and unmistakably a Hargrave. I didn't need to see the name tag to know who he was. Nathaniel. Richard's secret son. Born from one of his affairs, raised in private, then swept into the spotlight after Richard's death. The press had been gentle, a surprise heir. A late-in-life revelation. A son he quietly mentored. Quiet, my foot. Richard had been grooming him for years. Even while Elena screamed in her sleep, even while I was slipping sleeping pills into my tea to make it through the nights, Richard was painting a new legacy in another city, with another child. And now Nathaniel was running my museum. No, not mine. Not yet. But that was going to change. He gestured toward a painting, one of the surreal ones. The crowd murmured their admiration. He spoke of emotional texture, fractured symbolism, pain turned into beauty. He didn't know the truth behind any of it. But I did, and now I had proof. I stepped back from the peephole and turned to face the covered portrait of Elena once more. My daughter had become a ghost in a gallery, an echo in a brochure, a cautionary tale twisted into a chapter of a man's genius. But I wasn't going to let that stand. Nathaniel might have inherited the Hargrave name, the fortune, the fame, but I was the only one who had the truth. And I was going to tear the legacy apart from the inside, frame by frame. The letter arrived 2 days later. It was delivered by hand, pressed between the slats of my gate, wrapped in a sleek black envelope embossed with gold, the Hargrave Foundation. The kind of paper that expects silence from anyone who touches it. I took it inside with a strange calm, no rush, no panic. Just the certainty of a clock striking the hour I had been counting toward for years. The contents were simple, polished. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrave, you are cordially invited to an exclusive private dinner hosted by the Hargrave Foundation in honor of Richard Hargrave's life and artistic legacy. Location: Hargrave Museum. Grand Atrium time, 8 p.m. Saturday dress code. Formal attire. Your presence would mean the world to us. Nathaniel Hargrave. I stared at the name for a long time. Nathaniel had never once written to me, never called, never visited. Not even after the funeral. He'd stood like a porcelain doll at the pulpit, delivering a eulogy tailored for applause. Not once had he acknowledged Elena. Not once had he mentioned me. But now, suddenly, he wanted me at a dinner? Why? I didn't believe in coincidence. Not in this house. Not in this family. He knew I'd been in the museum. That had to be it. Maybe he'd noticed the painting had been moved. Maybe someone saw me slip out of room 12. Or maybe, and this seemed more likely, Nathaniel had finally realized that no matter how perfectly you craft a story, there's always one witness left unaccounted for. And I was done being quiet. I folded the invitation and set it beside the portrait of Elena, which I had since placed upright in the parlor. I hadn't dared unwrap it. Not yet. But I'd been sitting with it every night, like a mourner before a casket, waiting for the right moment to speak. Did you hear that, sweetheart? I whispered to the cloth-wrapped canvas. He wants me there. Wants to toast your father's genius. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went through old trunks and boxes, searching for something I hadn't worn in years. I chose a black velvet gown, simple, elegant, with long sleeves and a high collar. The kind of dress that demanded attention without asking for it. The kind of dress your enemies remember. I pinned my hair up, lined my eyes with a steadier hand than I thought I still possessed, and wore no jewelry but my wedding ring, tarnished, tight, but still there. Let him see it. Let them all see what was left of the woman who'd built the empire behind Richard Hargrave and then watched it collapse under the weight of his lies. On the evening of the dinner, the driver arrived precisely on time. He didn't speak much, just opened the door and nodded. I stepped in without a word, my fingers clutching a small velvet pouch in my lap, the torn pages from the ledger folded carefully inside. The car wound through the old familiar roads again, but this time, they didn't feel haunted. They felt expectant, like trees leaning in to hear what I might say, like the wind itself had paused to see how it would all end. When the museum came into view, bathed in golden light, its glass dome glowing like a beacon, I felt no fear. No grief. Only one thing. Clarity. Because I wasn't going to that dinner to celebrate Richard. I was going to pull the veil off his masterpiece. And I was going to do it in front of everyone. The grand atrium had never looked so artificial. Strings of crystal lights dripped from the ceiling like icicles. A string quartet played something delicate and expensive near the west wall. Long tables were arranged in a perfect crescent, covered in white linens and polished silverware that gleamed under the spotlights. And at the center of it all, framed in gold and floral arrangements, was a massive portrait of Richard Hargrave, eyes cast upward, brush in hand, painted to resemble something between a prophet and a martyr. He always did commission himself well. As I stepped inside, heads turned. The click of my heels against the marble floor echoed with every step. Conversations paused. Glasses tilted mid-sip. People stared like they'd seen a ghost wearing a velvet gown. And in a way, they had. I was the unfinished chapter. The woman they had written out of the museum's story. Nathaniel spotted me first. He was standing near the podium, flanked by museum trustees and art world parasites who had thrived on Richard's name for decades. He offered a smile that was meant to be gracious, but it faltered just for a moment. He hadn't expected me to look composed. Strong, present. He walked toward me with practiced ease, hands clasped. "Eleanor," he said warmly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I offered him a nod, not a smile. "You invited me. It would have been rude not to." He chuckled softly, playing his part for the crowd. "It's good to have you here." "Really? Tonight's about family, after all." The word curdled in the air between us. "Family. Elena would have liked that," I said, meeting his eyes. He blinked just once, but it was enough. A crack. He opened his mouth, but I turned away before he could speak and made my way toward the reserved seat at the center table. It was labeled Mrs. Eleanor Hargrave in calligraphy, perched beside a place card for Nathaniel Hargrave. How poetic. They had arranged us like a united front, the widow and the heir, guardians of Richard's legacy. Let them believe it. For a few minutes more, the dinner began. Toasts were given. Old colleagues recited memories of Richard with the polished lies of people who'd never known him privately. They spoke of his vision, his resilience, his devotion to truth through art. Truth? He wouldn't know the word if it hung itself in his studio. I listened with my wine untouched, my fork unmoved. Across the table, Nathaniel glanced at me now and then, curious, guarded. He was waiting for something. So was I. Finally, just before dessert, he stood and tapped his glass. "I'd like to say a few words," he announced, the quartet pausing behind him. "Tonight is not just about honoring Richard Hargrave's work. It's about acknowledging the people who helped shape it, who believed in it." He looked right at me. "My father often spoke of my late sister, Elena. He carried that grief every day. And of course, we're joined tonight by Eleanor Hargrave, his wife, his partner, the woman who stood beside him through every storm." There it was. The performance. Applause followed. Polite. Empty. I rose from my seat before he could sit. He looked startled. The crowd hushed. "I'd like to say a few words as well," I said, my voice calm but clear. I walked toward the podium slowly, the velvet pouch hidden in the folds of my dress. Nathaniel stepped aside, visibly unsure now. This wasn't on the schedule. I placed the pouch gently on the podium, opened it, and withdrew the folded pages from the ledger. I held them in my hand like scripture. "For years," I began, "this museum has celebrated Richard Hargrave as a man of genius. A visionary. A father. A husband." A pause. But Richard was also something else. He was a collector of secrets. Murmurs rose. Nathaniel took one small step forward. I continued, my voice sharper now. "Hidden within these walls, within this very building, is a room that none of you have ever seen. Room 12. Sealed. Omitted from every tour, every map. And in that room, there is a painting." I turned toward Nathaniel. "A portrait of Elena, one Richard painted just before she vanished." a painting he swore never existed. But it does. And so do these. I held up the ledger pages. His notes, his thoughts, his confessions. Nathaniel stepped closer, whispering under his breath. You need to stop. I looked at him, unflinching. No, I said. You need to listen. And with that, I began to read. Line by line. Truth by truth. And the applause died for good. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. My voice, measured and slow, cut through the air sharper than any scream could have. The guests sat frozen, champagne flutes lowered, their expressions melting from polite interest into something closer to horror. I read Richard's own words, the ones he'd never meant for public ears. The dates, the incidents, the notes scrawled in his uneven hand. Mentions of Elena's portrait. His obsession with her silence. The moment he stopped seeing her as his daughter and began seeing her as material. No one dared interrupt. Even Nathaniel stood still beside me, pale under the warm lights, his jaw clenched too tight to speak. He'd built his inheritance on a house of praise. But I had just cracked the foundation. And the room could feel it shifting. I am not here to tarnish his name, I said at last, folding the papers and placing them back into the pouch. He did that himself. I am here because my daughter's face has hung in silence long enough. I stepped away from the podium, leaving behind not a speech, but a reckoning. The silence afterward was immense. Then the whispers began. Who had known? Was it true? Could that painting still exist? I didn't need to hear the answers. I walked out. Nathaniel caught up with me at the marble staircase near the main gallery. His voice was low but fierce, a whisper wrapped in threat. You don't know what you've done. I turned to him slowly. No, I said, you don't. He looked shaken for the first time since I'd returned to the museum. I realized then he didn't understand what I had. He thought I had one weapon, the ledger, the painting, but I had more. Why now, he asked. Why come back and burn it all down? I leaned in, close enough that only he could hear me. Because I finally stopped grieving and started remembering. And when you remember everything, Nathaniel, you don't come to mourn. You come to reclaim. He stared at me, jaw tight. You won't win, he said. They still love him. They need to. I almost pitied him then. Let them love the ghost, I said. I've come for the bones. I turned and walked out through the main doors of the museum, not bothering to glance at the guests behind me. I didn't need their applause. I had something far more permanent. Truth. Later that night, alone again in my cottage, I finally unwrapped the painting. The portrait of Elena. Even in the dim light of the parlor, her eyes held me. There was pain there, yes, but something else too. A trace of defiance. I ran my hand gently along the edge of the frame and found something I hadn't noticed before. A small panel, loose, along the back. I eased it open with a knife, breath caught in my throat. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, stiff with age. A note, written in my daughter's handwriting. 5 words. He lied about the fire. I sat in silence, the words burning themselves into my brain. He lied about the fire. About what happened the night she vanished. The official story had been that Elena had run away after a fight, her room found empty, the back gate open, a fire in Richard's studio later that night, which destroyed a stack of works he claimed she'd vandalized. But now I knew better. The fire hadn't been about destruction. It had been about hiding something. And whatever it was, it hadn't all been consumed. Because she'd lived long enough to leave me this. My hand tightened around the paper. There was more. Still more. And if my daughter had survived longer than I was told, then this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the second act. I didn't sleep that night, not in the way sleep is supposed to be. My body lay still beneath the quilt, but my mind churned like a wheel in mud, turning and turning without ever finding ground. He lied about the fire. 5 words, carved from ash and memory. The official narrative had always been convenient. A domestic tragedy, softened for the art-consuming public. Elena gone, presumed runaway. A fire in Richard's studio just hours later, blamed on her teenage rage. Paintings destroyed. Chaos framed as catharsis. And when reporters came sniffing, Richard delivered tears on cue. The grieving father. The misunderstood genius. A perfect storm for public sympathy. But that note, my daughter's hand, told a different story. And suddenly, a decade of questions I'd sealed away broke free like smoke through a cracked window. At dawn, I went to the attic. Richard had always told me never to enter the locked chest. Old work, he said once. Nothing worth salvaging. But I remembered what the locksmith had said after the funeral. How he found a second false bottom. How he assumed it was empty. I hadn't checked it. Until now. The key from room 12 fit easily. Inside the chest was a cloth bundle tied in twine. I unwrapped it slowly, afraid the contents might crumble at the touch. They didn't. It was a set of photographs. Grainy, black and white, taken in Richard's studio the night of the fire. I recognized the half-finished canvases. The paint cans. The splattered tarp on the floor. But one photograph chilled my veins. It showed Elena. Alive. Not screaming. Not afraid. Just watching. Her eyes focused. Her posture guarded. She was standing at the far corner of the studio near the panel Richard always kept bolted, what he called his private alcove. The timestamp? 1:12 a.m. The fire was reported at 1:34. She had still been there. And what haunted me most wasn't that Richard had lied. It was that he'd documented it. Like he wanted to remember what he did. Or prove something to himself. I looked closer. In the bottom corner of the photo was a mark, a chalk symbol on the floor I'd never seen before. A spiral ringed in charcoal, like something ritualistic. Primitive. I remembered his words from years ago. Half whispered in his sleep. She wouldn't let me finish her. She bled into the paint. What had he done to her? Was the fire a cover-up or a cage? I needed answers from someone who had none of Richard's loyalty. Someone who had been in the background during those years, forgotten, but always observing. Mrs. Keene, our old housekeeper. She'd disappeared after the fire, said she wanted no part of the press. Moved inland, changed her name. But I remembered the address scribbled in one of Richard's journals. I had written it down, just in case. I found it in the back of my own recipe book, tucked between clippings of Elena's favorite lemon tarts and a dried rose she once pressed for a school project. A farmhouse. 2 towns over. No phone number. No surname. Just Keene. Farm. Dunswell Hill. I packed a small bag, left the painting wrapped on the parlor wall. And as I locked the door behind me, I whispered to the wind, "Hold on, Elena. I'm still coming." The road to Dunswell Hill was narrow and cracked, swallowed in parts by weeds that had long given up on civility. I drove slowly, headlights piercing the morning mist like a hesitant truth. The world here was quieter, untouched by art critics, gala lights, or the ever-watching gaze of Richard Hargrave's myth. The farmhouse emerged just past a bend, worn and slightly slanted, as though time had tried to topple it and failed. The windows were shuttered. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. And on the porch, nestled into a rocking chair with a tartan blanket draped across her knees, sat Mrs. Keene. She saw me before I reached the gate. Didn't wave. Didn't flinch. Just watched, her face unreadable beneath the soft folds of age. I stepped from the car, unsure if she'd even speak to me. "I didn't think you'd still be here," I said quietly. She rocked once, twice, then spoke in a voice like dry parchment. "I knew you'd come. Just didn't know when." I approached the porch slowly. "You know why I'm here." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached down, poured 2 mugs of tea from a chipped kettle beside her, and gestured to the empty chair. "Sit, Mrs. Hargrave. We'll speak plain, like women should have years ago." I obeyed, more out of bone-deep fatigue than obedience. I took the tea. It was bitter, but warm. For a while, we just sat, listening to the creak of the chair and the hush of wind through the dying orchard. She left that night, Keen said finally. But not the way he told it. I looked at her, heart tight. So she was alive after the fire? Mrs. Keen nodded once. Came to me just before dawn. Her hands were black with soot. Eyes wild. She said he locked the door, but I climbed through the vent. Said she'd watched him burn the paintings. Said he was trying to trap her inside one. I froze. Trap her? Inside a painting? Keen nodded again, slow and deliberate. He'd been going mad for months, saying she wasn't herself. Said she kept changing. Started drawing over his sketches in the night. He blamed her for the shadows in his work. Said she was feeding on it, growing stronger. My stomach churned. He believed she was inside the art. Mrs. Keen's eyes darkened. He tried to paint her out, layer over layer. Said he could mute her. That the right pigments, the right brush, could seal her in. That's what he was doing that night. When the fire caught, he was mid-stroke. Thought he'd succeeded. A gust of wind blew through the orchard. A crow cawed once, sharp and distant. She told me not to tell anyone, Keen whispered. Said if he knew she lived, he'd find her. Finish what he started. I clutched the arms of my chair. Where did she go? Keen looked at me with a slow, sad shake of her head. She wouldn't say. Just left me one thing before she vanished. She stood, joints creaking, and disappeared into the house. When she returned, she held a box. Old. Wooden. Burned along one edge. She said you'd know when it was time to open it. I took it in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. And warm. As if it had been waiting. What's inside? I asked. Mrs. Keen looked toward the horizon. Whatever Richard was trying to silence. I stood, tears pressing behind my eyes. I thought she was dead. She was, Keen said softly. To the world. But not to herself. That girl didn't run away. She escaped. I drove back with the box on the passenger seat, my hands clenched around the wheel. That night, I didn't open it. I sat beside it, listened, and I swear I heard something inside it move. It took me 2 days to gather the courage. The box sat on the table like a living thing, quiet, unmoving, but present in a way that unsettled the air around it. I didn't rush. I lit the fireplace. I brewed tea I never drank. I cleaned rooms that hadn't seen visitors in years. Anything to delay the moment. Because something in me already knew, whatever lay inside that box, it would not simply offer answers. It would demand action. When I finally opened it, the wood groaned. Not from age, but almost. Reluctance. Inside was a bundle of drawings. Dozens of them. Charcoal, ink, crayon. All on scraps of paper, some torn from school notebooks, others from Richard's old sketchbooks. The style was unmistakably Elena's. Fluid, raw, frantic. Some were childlike, others terrifyingly precise. She had drawn eyes. Repeatedly. Pages of them. Watching. Blinking. Some crying ink. Some scratched out. But it was the final drawing that made my breath catch. A floor plan. Of the Hargrave Museum. And not just the public areas, the hidden wings, the sealed rooms. A line led from room 12 through a narrow corridor I'd never seen, ending at a space marked with one word, echo. A room that didn't exist on any blueprint. A room no one had spoken of, except Elena. Beneath the floor plan was a note, hastily scrawled in the corner. If he finishes it, I disappear. But if someone hears me, I can come back. Don't let him finish it. Don't let him bury the echo. My fingers trembled as I traced the path. Echo. Was it a painting? A room? A name? I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. My reflection in the window looked older than usual, paler. As if I'd seen a ghost, and maybe I had. Not just my daughter's work, but her will. Her resistance. She'd left a trail. Hidden in plain sight. She hadn't wanted to be found by him. But she had wanted to be found. I lit every candle in the parlor and placed the final drawing in the center of the room. I stared at it for hours, memorizing every turn, every hallway. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I called the museum the next morning under a different name, Marion Hill, a pseudonym I hadn't used since the early days of Richard's travels. Claimed to be a private donor with interest in archival spaces. Requested a tour of the lower vaults. They were delighted. Private money always was. I would enter again, this time not through invitation or memory, but through stealth. And I would find the echo. Because I now understood what the painting had never said out loud. He hadn't just tried to paint over her. He had tried to erase her soul. And somehow she had survived inside the very walls he built to contain her. This time, I wouldn't leave without her. Not her truth. Not her name. Not her voice. The museum at night was not quiet, it breathed. Even stripped of its guests and gala lights, it whispered with old air and unseen movement. Pipes ticked behind the walls. Temperature-controlled chambers hissed faintly as they adjusted themselves in accordance with priceless secrets. Footsteps echoed in a way that didn't quite belong to you. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. Dressed not for morning this time, but for war. Slacks. Flat shoes. Hair pinned back. The private security escort, an older man named Felix, led me through the maintenance corridor, glancing down occasionally at the paperwork I'd forged. He didn't ask many questions. That was the power of wealth and assumed familiarity. Just a few fabricated credentials, a letterhead from a fake foundation, and I was back inside the skeleton of Richard's kingdom. This section's off limits to the public, he said, tapping a keypad beside a steel door. Even trustees need special clearance. The lock clicked open, and the door gave way with a breath of cool, dry air. We call this the Deep Archive. The lights flickered on slowly, one by one, revealing a corridor lined with steel drawers and locked vaults. Beyond that, walls of shelving, old canvases wrapped in muslin, and bins of retired collections, pieces Richard had either deemed too flawed for exhibition or too personal for sale. I murmured my thanks and assured him I'd be no more than 30 minutes. When he left, I waited for his footsteps to vanish before turning toward the rear of the chamber. That's where I found the door. It wasn't marked exactly, but I recognized it from Elena's map. Half hidden behind a rolling storage rack, it was flush with the wall, painted the same dull gray, with no knob. Just a vertical seam. A false panel. I pressed my hands along the left side until I felt the faintest click. The door hissed open an inch, and behind it, darkness. I stepped through with nothing but a flashlight and my daughter's floor plan. The space beyond was narrow, dusty, choked with the smell of old varnish and something else, something bitter, chemical, metallic. The kind of smell I'd once associated with solvents and turpentine. The scent of a painter losing his grip. I walked slowly, beam of light sweeping across tarps, broken frames, and scattered tubes of paint that had rotted into puddles of color. My breath grew short. The air was heavier here. Not from dust, but from something less visible. Like memory thickened to mist. The corridor opened into a small octagonal room. And I knew, instantly, that I had found the echo. The walls were entirely covered in unfinished paintings, hundreds of them, layered on top of one another, edge to edge, as though Richard had tried to trap something between them. Some bore Elena's face, her silhouette, fragments of her expressions. Others were abstract, but bleeding with familiarity. Her hair, her eyes, her hands, stretched across brushstrokes like she was trying to claw her way back into the light. In the center of the room stood an easel, and on it a canvas, covered by a black cloth. I stepped forward. My hand trembled. I pulled the cloth free. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. It was a painting of me. Older, grayer, but unmistakably me. Standing in this very room. A painting of this moment. It was signed. R.H. and dated. Tomorrow. I staggered back. Impossible. But something inside me said otherwise. Because the eyes in the painting, my eyes, were wide not with fear, but recognition. As though I had seen something. As though I was staring at someone just out of frame. I turned around slowly. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint. Tearful. Mama. I stood frozen. Not out of fear, but reverence. Like a prayer answered in a voice you hadn't heard since childhood. Mama. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't memory dressed in longing. It was her. Elena. I turned slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip, the beam jerking across the room's layered walls. Faces blinked back, blurred, disjointed, but none of them moved. None of them spoke. And then I saw it. The painting just to the left of the easel. It had once been vibrant blues, golds, reds, but had been dulled by time and overpainting. I stepped closer. There, beneath a cracked layer of ochre, I saw the faint outline of a girl's face. Her eyes were open. Desperate. Her mouth was parted, as if mid-word. Mama, I whispered, placing my hand to the canvas. A surge of warmth traveled through my fingertips. The painting responded. The surface pulsed faintly, like breath beneath layers of pigment. My hand recoiled, heart thudding in my chest like thunder behind a locked door. This wasn't a portrait. It was a prison. And my daughter was still inside. I scanned the room, my breath ragged. Richard hadn't tried to immortalize her. He'd tried to contain her. The whispers, the rituals, the spiral symbols, he believed Elena's spirit had bled into his work. That she had taken something from him when she fled the fire. He hadn't just wanted her gone, he wanted her bound. Not anymore, I said aloud, stepping back to the center of the room. I grabbed the black cloth I had pulled from the easel and tore it into strips. Wrapped one around each hand, tight, like makeshift gloves. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the smallest thing I had brought, a palette knife. Not for painting. For scraping. I returned to the wall, to the portrait that pulsed beneath cracked layers. And I began to cut. The paint peeled slowly, curled like old skin. Dust rose in clouds, stinging my throat. But underneath, colors emerged. Skin tones. Strands of hair. The eyes. Her eyes. And for one terrifying, magnificent second, I saw them move. She blinked. Not in the painting. In me. My knees buckled. I gripped the wall for balance, tears streaking down my face. Her presence filled the room like sunlight pressing against heavy curtains. She was here. Still here. Mama, the voice came again. Clearer now. A child's plea aged by time. I'm here, I whispered. I see you. I never stopped. The temperature in the room shifted. The air grew warmer, lighter. The paintings along the walls seemed to fade, dim, as if they were finally letting go. And then I heard something else. A sound I had not heard in over 30 years. Laughter. Faint. Pure. My daughter's laughter. But behind it, another sound. Footsteps. In the corridor. Approaching. Not soft. Not hesitant. Heavy. Measured. Someone else had entered the echo. And I already knew who it was. The footsteps were unmistakable. Each one landed with the weight of entitlement. Not searching, not unsure, but claiming. Like someone returning to a room they believed already belonged to them. Nathaniel. I stepped back from Elena's painting, my hands still wrapped in the torn black cloth, streaked with pigment, and something deeper, memory, grief, and the faintest residue of hope. The air around me pulsed faintly. The warmth of her presence hadn't vanished. It had simply grown still. Watching. Waiting. Like me. Nathaniel emerged from the corridor with a flashlight of his own. His tie was loosened. His sleeves rolled up. He looked more like Richard than ever in that moment, sharp-featured, determined, oblivious to what he stood in the presence of. His light found me. He didn't speak right away, just stared. You really couldn't leave it alone, he said at last. I turned, calmly, and gestured to the room. Neither could you. He stepped inside, gaze drifting across the walls, pausing at the unfinished paintings, the spiral scratched into corners, the layered echoes of a man's unraveling guilt. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should this room," I replied. "Yet here we are." He sighed, stepping toward the easel. Toward my portrait, the one Richard had painted before he died. The one dated tomorrow. "Do you know why he painted you?" he asked. "Why he finished that last one?" I didn't answer. Because I did. He was warning him. Or preparing him. "You were always the variable," Nathaniel continued, circling me now. "He couldn't predict you. Couldn't contain you. But he thought if he rendered you properly, he might understand how it would end." "It ends with her," I said, my voice firm. I turned the flashlight toward the scraped portrait of Elena. Her face was fully visible now, soft, determined, ancient in its sadness. Her expression was no longer frozen in fear. It was watchful, alive. Nathaniel followed the light with his eyes. He flinched when he saw it, just slightly, but it was enough. "You knew she was alive," I said. His jaw tensed. "You helped him trap her." Silence. I stepped closer. "She trusted you once. Called you brother. And you let him lock her in here." He didn't deny it. "She was changing," he said, as if that justified everything. "She wasn't like the rest of us." He said she could cross over. Leave the body. Move into the canvas. Into anything. He showed me. "And you believed him?" I asked, horrified. "You believed that madness?" He stared at the wall behind me. "Once. Until I saw her fight back. Until she started appearing in other paintings. In dreams. In mirrors. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Eleanor. She was trying to wake us up. But he couldn't allow that. So he sealed her in. And I helped him." The weight of it settled in the air like ash. "You can help me undo it," I said, voice trembling. "You can end it. Let her go." Nathaniel looked at me for a long time, then shook his head. "No, you don't understand. If she comes back, she brings everything with her. What he hid, what we buried. She's not just a girl anymore, Eleanor. She's what's left when truth refuses to die." He reached into his coat, pulled out a lighter. "I'm sorry." I lunged before the flame could spark. We collided near the easel, bodies crashing into old canvases. The room erupted in motion, dust, torn fabric, toppling frames. The lighter skidded across the floor. My elbow struck his ribs. His hand gripped my wrist. He was younger, stronger, but I was angrier. And behind us, the walls began to whisper. Soft at first, then louder. Voices, names, screams, laughter. "Mama." That voice, clearest of all, cut through the chaos like light through stained glass. Nathaniel froze. The sound came from inside the painting. Elena's eyes glowed faintly, then blinked. He stumbled backward. Shaken, pale. "What is she?" I stepped in front of the painting. "She's what's left of the truth you tried to bury." I turned to the portrait and whispered, "Come out, darling. It's time." The room filled with wind. Candles burst to life. The paint cracked open, and my daughter stepped forward. She didn't step like a ghost. She stepped like someone who remembered how to walk in a world that had forgotten her. The frame didn't shatter. The canvas didn't tear. It simply opened, like a doorway folding inward, and from its depths, my daughter emerged, not dripping paint or cloaked in shadow, but solid, graceful, and more real than anything else in the room. Her body flickered, only slightly, as if the veil between dimensions still clung to her shoulders like mist. Her eyes, however, were clear. They were Elena's eyes, not the frightened girl from the past, not the weeping child buried in pigment. These were the eyes of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. She looked at me first, and something inside me shattered, softly, silently. 30 years of silence. 30 years of standing still. Of loss. Of never knowing if I'd failed her. If she'd been alone, trapped, afraid. But now she stood in front of me, whole and alive. "Mama," she whispered again, and this time, her voice was full. round, human. I rushed to her. We met in the middle of the room, arms wrapping around each other. My fingers gripped her like a lifeline, afraid that if I blinked she might fade. But she didn't. She held me back. Not weakly, with strength. Behind us, Nathaniel stumbled against the wall, hands shaking. She shouldn't be able to do this, he muttered. It's not possible. He said it couldn't. She was never his to contain, I said, turning to face him, my daughter still at my side. You only believed that because you never saw her. Not truly, not like I did. Elena looked at him, and for a moment I thought she might speak. Instead, she stepped forward and raised her hand. Not in anger, in memory. The room responded. All at once, the paintings along the walls began to crack, fractures racing across the surfaces, like spider webs catching light. One by one, the false images splintered, revealing what had been buried underneath. Elena's sketches, her colors, her truth. Richard had tried to silence her with overpainting, with his own narratives, but they had never taken root. Her work had lived beneath his all along. The echo wasn't a prison. It was a gallery, a place where the voices he tried to erase had been hiding, waiting for the right moment to break through. And that moment had come. Nathaniel turned toward the exit. He didn't run. He simply withdrew, quietly, as if he finally understood that he had never inherited Richard's legacy. Only his rot. And rot, when exposed to air, doesn't grow. It decays. He disappeared into the corridor, swallowed by the very shadows he had tried to control. I turned back to Elena. She smiled faintly. I couldn't leave, she said. Not while he still owned the silence. And now? I asked, voice shaking. Her eyes sparkled with something that hadn't existed in them when she was a girl. Power. Now, she said, I have work to finish. She moved to the easel, my portrait, the one Richard had painted with the timestamp of tomorrow. She placed her fingers on it, and the painting changed. The brushstrokes softened. The colors brightened. My expression, once wide-eyed with recognition, grew calm, certain, whole. She had painted over his last word, with her own. And for the first time since her disappearance, I felt the weight leave my body. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was part of her story. At last, we stayed in the echo until morning. Not out of fear. Not because we were trapped. Because we chose to. For once, the space that had been built as a vault, an oubliette for the inconvenient, had become something else. A sanctuary. A studio. A place where my daughter could breathe without being hunted by brushstrokes. Elena moved through the room slowly, like a curator assessing which memories were salvageable. She ran her fingers across the canvases, some she had drawn herself, others she had simply inhabited. Paintings Richard thought he'd smothered beneath layers of self-mythology. But she had always been there. She hadn't been destroyed by the fire. She had been preserved in its smoke. I watched her work in silence. No questions. No interruptions. We had waited too long for this moment to dilute it with noise. Finally, as the first light crept in through the ventilation shaft, she turned to me. I'm not meant to stay here, she said softly. My breath caught. I just got you back. She smiled. You never lost me. You kept me alive longer than anyone. I sat slowly on the floor beside her, the weight of what she was saying settling in. This place is your story now, she said. But I'm not only memory. I'm what comes after. She moved back to the easel and pulled free the final canvas, the one she had repainted. My face glowed softly in it, not with light, but with knowing. She'd changed the background too. No longer the echo. It was now our parlor, with the portrait of her hanging in full view, and a candle burning beside it. She handed it to me. I need you to hang this. In the main gallery. Elena, they'll never understand it, she said. But they'll feel it. And that's enough. I nodded, too full to speak. We left the echo together, side by side. No alarms. No cameras. The museum was still asleep in the hour before the world woke up. She walked with me to the entrance, pausing beneath the massive bronze bust of Richard Hargrave. She looked up at it, then back at me, and said, "You can melt that down now." I laughed through my tears, and when I blinked, she was gone. No sound, no flash, just absence, like the moment after a candle is snuffed and the smoke still curls in the air. But she'd left something behind, a a warmth in my chest that hadn't lived there in years. 3 days later, the museum unveiled a new installation. They called it Inheritance, the final portrait. No one knew who had painted it. The plaque bore no signature, just a quote, "Let those who were silenced become the loudest frame in the room." It now hangs opposite Richard's self-portrait, and visitors stop there longer, because something in it pulls them, not with grandeur, but with gravity, as if it's whispering, there's more than one kind of legacy. It's strange, the way silence sounds when it's no longer filled with fear. The cottage is quieter now, but in a different way than before. Not empty, just peaceful. The portrait of Elena hangs above the fireplace, finally unwrapped. Her expression isn't mournful. It's not even haunted. It's complete. Sometimes, in the morning, I swear I see her eyes shift just a little, as if tracking the light. As if watching me pour the tea she once liked. As if remembering. I haven't returned to the museum since the unveiling. I don't need to. The final portrait did what it was meant to do. It didn't tell people what to believe. It made them feel something they couldn't name. That's what real truth does. It doesn't need to be understood to be undeniable. Nathaniel never spoke publicly about what happened. He still runs the museum, though his speeches are shorter now. He avoids the East Wing. I think he knows the walls there are listening. I left something behind in room 12, a single empty frame, leaning against the back wall. No canvas, no title, just space. A reminder, not everything needs to be painted to be real. Some truths are better felt in absence. The wind through the orchard carries no screams anymore. Only rustling leaves and the occasional crow, still circling out of habit. I walk through the trees now without dread. I leave my door unlocked, because for the first time in my long life, I am not waiting for something to return. I am simply here, still, and that is enough. Here the story ends. Thanks for watching. Hit like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more true and real stories.